Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast, where we're going to be analysing the public opinion underpinning some of the tumultuous changes we've seen in politics and Westminster over the last few days. My name's Gideon Skinner. I'm Head of Political Research at Ipsos, and I'm replacing your usual host, Kieran Pedley, but it's okay. I can confirm that he's not under a desk, and he will be here to lead these podcasts in the future. I'm joined by two fantastic colleagues, Cameron Garrett. Hi, Cameron.
Good morning, Gideon.
And giving us the perspective from our Manchester office. Hi, Holly.
Morning, Gideon.
And we're going to be talking about the challenges facing the Conservatives, the reaction to the mini budget, and views towards the Conservatives' economic policies and economic competence, and what it all means for Labour too. If you like what you hear and you find it interesting, please like or subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts, and look out for more from Ipsos on a whole range of issues from politics and other social issues over the next few weeks. I hope you enjoy it. So I just wanted to start actually for both of you, and we've been doing kind of lots of polling over the last few weeks. It's all coming to a head right now, but if there was one particular nugget from the data, is there anything that you'd pull out that you thought was particularly interesting to you?
I think it would be how sharply Liz Truss's satisfaction rating has declined. So it's gone from -2 when she joined, and she's now down to -51, which is, when you chart it up, is quite a dramatic fall. And actually, amongst 2019 Conservative voters, her satisfaction rating is -28, and Starmer's is -13. So even with those who voted for them at the last election, Starmer's pulling out in front now. And that's pretty dramatic, I think.
That is pretty dramatic. You're stealing some of my thunder for later, but I'll let you have that one. Holly, how about you?
I was going in a similar vein, to be honest. I thought it was striking a couple of weeks ago at conference. Kieran, who you mentioned earlier, was talking about the jury still being out on Liz Truss. That was literally a matter of weeks ago at that point. When we asked about job satisfaction, 44% of people said they didn't know if she was doing a good or bad job, didn't have an opinion. And I think we can safely say in our latest data, a lot of those people have now made their mind up. And we'll hear more about that as we discuss the figures we've got in our latest round today.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll discuss that in a bit more detail a bit later. For me, I was going to pick up actually something from some of our polling just after the mini budget, which I thought was a great example of how something like that really can cut through, and which clearly explains so much of the change that we've been seeing. When we ask people how much what they judge the economy on, the proportion of people who say they judge it on the strength of the pound after the movements immediately after the mini budget sort of doubled just in that week, and we saw an increase in the proportion of people blaming the government for the cost of living crisis. So I think that really shows how much those events of the mini budget kind of cut through to the public, and the damage potentially it's doing to the Conservatives if they're associated with some more and more with some of the economic difficulties that the public is facing. So I said it's been an extraordinary change over the last few days. We've seen one Chancellor fired, another one appointed. We've seen kind of the reversals of much of the tax changes in the mini budget and the centrepiece of the growth strategy. We've even seen the Prime Minister apologising and taking responsibility for the mistakes on national TV. So we should start off with the at least immediate cause of all of that, which is the bad reaction to the mini budget. I mean, even when we ask people to take everything into account, you know, the cap on energy bills and the tax cuts that were originally planned, as well as, of course, the potential for higher interest rates, we still found most people saying that they would feel worse off. And this included a big chunk of Middle Britain as well. I mean, we know, of course, that concerns are particularly high amongst more vulnerable groups, low-income groups, so renters are a part of that. But it's clear that, as I say, parts of what we could call Middle Britain, mortgage holders and the middle-aged, are clearly feeling under the pinch as well. And I think that feeds through, and that's got to be a concern for the Conservatives.
Yep, and also in those immediate reactions to the mini budget, we saw kind of traditional attack lines on the Conservatives come through, as in this is a mini budget which is helping the highest earners and big companies and harming everyone else, which kind of is feeding Labour their attack lines almost.
And we saw that picked up in our findings too. No, you're right. And that also led through to some historically bad ratings for Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor. 2/3 were unhappy with him. Only around about 1 in 4 Conservative voters were positive, and really only kind of chancellors like Norman Lamont and Ken Clarke in the midst of the sort of the knock-on effects of Black Wednesday in the mid-90s have had that level of kind of public opprobrium, and that's not helpful for the Conservatives or for the government, given how important the economy is. I mean, we know, Holly, that it's cost of living and the economy more generally are top of our issues index. They have been for a while. It's clear the public are worried about that.
Yeah, and it's really not helpful in your position as Chancellor to be starting from such a low point. Often we see a bit of a bounce with ratings when people come into a new position, and maybe their policies might have an impact a bit later on. But to be starting kind of from the lowest polling point of any Chancellor we've ever polled, it didn't bode well from him from the off, really, did it?
It didn't, yeah. I mean, like going back to 1976, even Dennis Healey wasn't getting that bad results. And then, of course, the trouble for the government is that it started, the economy is such a central point for them. It's so important for the public. It's clearly their top priority now, that it was feeding through and affecting them. I think, both of you have said, pulling out the point about people started off reserving judgment a bit on Liz Truss, but that relatively high number of don't knows for a new Prime Minister fell a lot in her second month. But the trouble is, nearly all of that, it looks like, and probably more, went into kind of dissatisfied, and went into the negatives. And similarly for satisfaction with the government, that had been low for some time already, but that fell even further. And none of those are really the worst ever scores that we've seen. I mean, we've seen John Major, Theresa May get worse scores, for example, and Margaret Thatcher's government got worse scores at certain points.
I would say, though, when they were receiving those scores, apart from John Major, they were in their dying days of government. They were some amongst their last ever scores. So yeah, it's not much of a honeymoon.
It's not, and it's not great company to be in, to be getting similar scores to, say, Gordon Brown at the time of the financial crash, and that's not necessarily where you want to be. And you're absolutely right. The key point is that no Prime Minister has fallen so fast, so quickly in our data, and so clearly Liz Truss is going to have to be hoping that first impressions in this case don't last. But given all that, it's not surprising that something had to change, and they did change. Isn't that right, Holly?
Yeah, and I think the worrying thing for Liz Truss amongst her own ratings were the ratings that we were seeing amongst traditional Conservative supporters. I mean, you would expect with a new Prime Minister coming in that the ratings amongst maybe the general public who hadn't made their mind up yet, or traditional Labour supporters, wouldn't have been that favourable. But to see the drop-off that we have in the manner that we have and at the speed that we have amongst Conservative voters is probably the reason that she had to make the decisions that she ultimately did with a Chancellor, given what we see with our economic optimism index, for example.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's been pretty low for, really since the spring, and isn't showing any signs of getting better. But that sort of makes me think, actually, she was, of course, we know she was coming into a difficult environment. She was picking up a difficult legacy with low levels of economic optimism, with low levels of satisfaction with the government and delivery of the government on many issues already. And Cameron, you've been looking at some of the more fundamental challenges that the Conservatives have been facing.
Yep. So I remember about a month ago speaking to Kieran here about the challenge facing any new Prime Minister will be having to rebuild the ship, being the Tory brand, the Conservative brand, whilst also steering the ship and making some tough policy decisions for the country as a whole. It feels like she hasn't really rebuilt the ship. It feels like it's kind of now a dinghy and they're sticking plasters on it and chucking out the water overboard. So yeah, you're right. The Conservatives weren't in a great place beforehand. But yeah, it's got worse, basically. So on key measures like, are they fit to govern? Under Boris Johnson a year ago, around a third of people said they were fit to govern, which was low for the Conservatives. They'd seen majority of people saying that whilst in government. This has now dropped to 16%, so it's halved since Boris Johnson, and 35% say Labour are fit to govern. Divided, 65% say the Conservatives are now divided, 36% say that about Labour, which is their lowest score whilst in opposition. A good team of leaders, 11% now say that about the Conservatives, and 30% say that about Labour. Extreme, a third of people now say the Conservatives are extreme, 12% about Labour. You can just reel these off. They're quite bad for them. And there's stuff which the Labour Party traditionally leads on, about concerned about people in need, where they're keeping up their levels. 50% of people say the Labour Party are the best party for that. 13% now say just the Conservative Party are concerned about people in need. And what's interesting is that the Labour Party aren't actually moving on some of these measures. It's just the collapse in the Conservative vote. So on measures like fit to govern, good team of leaders, they're actually, Labour are polling similar to where they were with Ed Miliband. It's just then you had David Cameron's Conservatives they were facing, whereas there's just been a collapse in the Conservative.
You're right, and some of those are the lowest that the Conservatives have seen, for a decade or more. Which are the ones that sort of stand out where the Conservatives maybe were, as you say, there are some things where Labour have always had a traditional lead perhaps over the Conservatives, but where are the ones where the Conservatives perhaps you can really see, they had a lead when they were winning elections, but now they're dropping behind?
It would definitely be those ones like fit to govern and have a good team of leaders. So those kind of more ones which are, can you do the job? Can you be a government, basically? And all of this is feeding into our voting intention. So we have a 21-point lead for the Labour Party now, which is their biggest lead since 2002. If there was an election tomorrow, 47% of people tell us they would vote for the Labour Party, 26% say the Conservative Party. So that's Labour's highest vote share since November 2012, and the Conservatives since June 2019. So I have seen some people on Twitter and other social media outlets saying, look, the Conservatives were here in June 2019 and they went and won an election 6 months later. What would you think about that?
Well, so, I mean, as you say, Boris Johnson similarly had very low satisfaction scores with the government when he first took it on, and the Conservatives had very low voting intention scores around that time as well. I suppose the big difference is that we know that Labour also had their own troubles around that time, around the time of the European elections. They weren't getting great scores either. And of course, the context was very different. You had Brexit as a bigger issue. You were up against a different leader, and the economy was in a different place. You didn't have the same level of concern about cost of living and inflation that we've just seen kind of really rise rapidly over the last 6 months to be sort of the highest that we've recorded for since the early 1980s, really for a long time. And this is a new concern for the public, and you can see how that adds on to the level of uncertainty that the public are facing. And I think also you're right, it is those competency things that are particularly striking. It is also, although kind of perhaps, as you say, being concerned about people in real need has never been a real strength for the Conservatives, I think you can also see them falling back on measures like just understanding the problems facing Britain, like a sense of, do they get it? That sort of halfway between competence and empathy, at least they're picking up on what needs to be done. And on that measure, they're falling behind. I mean, that's sort of that comparison is interesting. You went to Conservative Party conference this year. What was your pickup from that? What did you take away? And was there anything particularly interesting that anyone said that rung a bell for you?
The day after the big Labour leads started dropping, and on the surface, everyone seemed to be quite pleasant, having a good time at party conference. But you did get the idea at some of the panels we were at that it was kind of rabbits in headlights at some of these big Labour leads we were getting. Something that you said on a panel actually stuck with me about sticky voters. So we have 1 in 5 people now switching from voting Conservatives in the last election to Labour now in our latest polling. And these people, once they've made their minds, are less likely to switch back. So sticky voters stuck with me. And also something one of our panellists, Matt Holhouse from The Economist, said about the price of leadership renewal is delivery. So if we are entering another debate about a new prime minister and replacing Liz Truss, we're just getting into another debate of not actually doing anything. Matt Holhouse pointed to the fact that he was speaking about the online harms bill with David Cameron 7 years ago, and that was just coming up again in Parliament. With the cost of living, they are kind of been stunted getting stuff through because they've been spending time debating about who should actually lead them. And that's really stuck with me. Holly, I know you were at Labour Party conference. What was the vibe there?
Quite a different vibe, although having not been at both, I don't want to speak for both parties, but I just want to pick up on something you said a moment ago, actually, about the favourable and unfavourable kind of traits with the parties. And I think it's really important, and there are three kind of key notable ones I'd pick out there. Traditionally, like, there are three key measures of a successful government, I would say, and usually the Conservatives have been quite good on these measures, and I pick those out as cohesion and togetherness, so we've got that down as division, as strong leadership, and as competence, often economic competence. And the fact that we've had such swings on those three measures in recent times in the wrong direction for the Conservative Party, I think is potentially quite ominous for them moving forward. So unless they see these measures swing back relatively quickly in a positive direction, I really think they're going to struggle moving forwards at the next election, whenever that may be. And we don't want to make predictions on that, I don't think.
And one of the things that Cameron mentioned there, Holly, was raising the question about how much of this is Conservative weakness and how much of it is Labour strength. So you've been looking at some numbers on that as well.
I have, yeah, and I think in previous podcasts that we've done, or in previous releases of our data, we've seen the Conservatives going in the wrong direction, but there's not been that much movement necessarily in the Labour numbers in the other direction. But it's worth kind of looking at the figures we have now and what's happening with the reputation of the government, of the Prime Minister, and the Conservative Party as a whole on a bit of a downward spiral in some of our numbers. I think the problem for them is they've also started now to lose ground on some key policy issues as well that they've traditionally been quite strong on. According to our figures, Labour are ahead now on every single policy measure we track except for defence. But most significantly at the moment, as we've been discussing, our measures relating to the economy, I think, are where it's hitting them hard. And they've traditionally kind of prided themselves on being economically competent, strong and stable, stuck for quite a while, sensible with the government finances. So for Labour to be leading on some of these things, and also being able to pick up some attack lines on these fronts as well, has to be a worry for Conservatives who are trying to defend their record and their strength on these policies. So when we ask people who we think does the best job on managing the economy, Labour are now 13 points ahead, and they've overtaken now the Conservatives on that measure for the first time since pre-2008. So they've not been ahead on this measure since before the global financial crash, and I think that is a pretty historic rating that we can see in our data. Similar things on taxation, which you wouldn't necessarily think the public would think that Labour were going to be doing the best job on. They're 19 points ahead in that measure as well. And on unemployment, despite the figures that we see the government coming out with the forecast from the OBR, and also they talk a lot about unemployment in PMQs as well, Labour are now 15 points ahead on that as well. So traditional economic issues that have been held strongly within the Conservative space for a number of years, and in some cases longer than a decade, are now swinging towards Labour, and that's really, I think, got to be a concern for them moving forwards.
Yeah, particularly when we know how important those issues are for the public right now and how they're dominating discourse. And then I suppose it's because it's policies are obviously important, but we also know it's not just about policies. Individual policies can be popular, but people also need to have a belief and a confidence that the party and the leadership as a whole are can be relied on, and they want to have trust and faith in them as well. What do our numbers show about that for Labour?
Yeah, so obviously to be seen as being competent on a number of issues, as you said, is different to those actual policies being put into practice and having the people in place to have confidence in those people. So at the moment, according to our measures, almost half of people now think Labour are ready to form a government. They're at 47% now, and that is the highest level of agreement we've had since they've been in opposition, so since 2010, and that's higher than any score that Ed Miliband ever hit, higher than any score Jeremy Corbyn ever hit, and it's actually now comparable to what we saw with Cameron in April of 2010, so just before he was elected, and the highest Labour have ever actually had in opposition since Blair, just before he was elected in April 97. So as we said earlier, the numbers for the Conservatives are heading in the wrong direction, but unlike the past few months of polling that we've done, we're now actually seeing a shift in some of these competence measures for Labour at the same time, which is why I think we're seeing such a strengthening in the overall voting intention poll, with people genuinely now potentially thinking that they could see a Labour Party in government and they could see Keir Starmer as prime ministerial material.
Yeah, and that's just going to add to the concerns. I mean, that's one other way in which it's slightly different for the Conservatives now than it has been, say, before most of the other elections that we've seen, isn't it, Cameron?
Yes, and I think that's why they are concerned. That's why we've had Jeremy Hunt in place, and trying to restore some of that economic competency. The problem is they have gone too far, too fast, as Liz Truss says, and whether they can regain that back. The Conservatives won't be looking forward to another election. I think they'll probably be trying to put that off for as long as possible. But yes, what I found interesting about the Labour Party was also Keir Starmer's satisfaction ratings have risen a little bit. He's still on -1, so he's not like overwhelmingly loved the guy, make him Prime Minister now, still behind Blair. But you are seeing them benefiting from this, and that's going to be worrying the Conservative Party more and more.
Yes, you're right, and I suppose that, just to bring it all together, that adds to the challenges of the Conservatives. They if you're trying to sum it all up, they're being challenged on economic competence and delivering on the cost of living, which is the top issue we know facing the country. That's adding on to a decline in their overall party image that we've been tracking over the last couple of years on, as you say, some of those key metrics like being fit to govern. They're not where they were when they were winning elections 2015, 2017, 2019, and the lead that they had over Labour on some of those issues now. And at the same time, first impressions of Liz Truss have not started off in the best place. But they are also now facing a Labour Party that, whilst still has got doubters to win over and is not in the same sort of place as, say, a Tony Blair was before 1997, but nevertheless has got rid of a lot of the negative doubts about them that maybe existed in public opinion earlier before their previous leaders.
Yeah, no longer really seen as extreme or divided, and has a credible leader.
And I think crucially amongst the Labour supporters as well, trajectory in the run-up to an election, which we have to say is 2 years out, but trajectory and the direction of travel is really important, and momentum as well, pardon the pun, for Keir Starmer. He's now moving in a positive direction with his own supporters, and we saw in the 2019 election there was quite a lot of switching. So if he's able to secure his base and secure the figures that he's getting at the minute, with kind of 60+% satisfaction amongst core Labour supporters, that's kind of a positive direction for him to be moving on, and a positive start point if you can secure your own support, which in previous elections Labour have struggled to do against different oppositions.
Yes, you're right. And of course, at the same time, the Conservatives are going to have to be hoping that with all the changes that we've gone through and they've gone through and had to go through over the last few days, they can at least get over that bump, and are going to be trying to sort of claw back and build back some of that credibility that they had before. But we can keep on tracking that and see how successful they're going to be.
It's probably worth saying as well, just to reflect the volatility in government. A general election is 2 years out at time of recording. That might change.
I think a lot might change between then and now if the last couple of days, weeks, years, decades has shown us. But it's a great time it's a very interesting time to live through as a pollster, maybe, rather than beware of living in interesting times. But I hope you found this podcast interesting too, and helping to explain some of what's going on. As I mentioned, if you've enjoyed it, like or subscribe, and look out for more podcasts from Ipsos in the future. Bye-bye.